Asyle, the Engineer, and the Island. Week 12, Day 1. It's now been 3 months since I was marooned on this island, and my accomplishments so far are pretty impressive for the short amount of time I've been here. My taro and yam gardens have started growing in noticeably, along with the brilliant hibiscus plants, vanilla grass, and bamboo dotted around the compound. I have hen houses dotting the forest. I have a kitchen and cellar stocked with dried fish, fruits, and eggs. I have a beach hut, a conveying trot line with bone hooks, stone weights, coconut floats, and of course a catamaran I never use. I have a workshop with a water mill, powering a lathe, grindstone, drill press, potting wheel, rope twiner, and even a small textile factory. I have a burgeoning chemical lab with a wind-powered ventilation system, percolating minerals from the island's lava tubes, and dozens of empty glazed pots waiting to be filled with exotic solutions and powders. I have a sophisticated solar kiln that allows me to boil my water and fire my pots without the need for fire, and even a walk-in freezer powered by the heat of the sun and the inky void between the stars. I have no interest in resting on morals, though. There's still a lot to do, and keeping busy helps me stay sane. Moreover, at this point I'm finally starting to feel invigorated with my progress. I still feel the solar array has a lot of room for improvement, and I have mosaics to finish building in the kitchen and lab. And I have chemical refinement experiments to complete in the lab itself. I've been working really hard, though. Even though last week was sort of a break, I can feel all the work catching up to me. I think it's time to do something to just make my life a little more comfortable again. What I'd really like to do, to help me deal with the unbearable heat, since sitting in the cellar all day isn't safe, is to create a real bathhouse. I've created a simple open-air shower, but I think it's time to refine it. It would also be nice if I didn't have to use a chamber pot as a toilet, too, so my other priority this week is building a proper latrine, ideally with some means of rapid aerobic decomposition, like my composter. While I'm at it, I might as well complete the sanitation function of the building with places to clean my clothes and dishes. Finally, I want a freshwater pool, so I don't have to keep climbing into the workshop reservoir, which has started to crumble around the edge. With a goal in sight, after my morning chores, during which I put more sand in the kiln for lime later, I began devising more of a plan before beginning construction. Since these functions are going to rely on water, I decided the ideal place to set up a bathhouse would be just upstream of the workshop, as I'll be able to use it as an additional water reservoir for the water wheel. I made a new digging stick and marked out the reservoir site on the ground, which will form the back wall of the bathhouse, much like the reservoir on the workshop. I can then put spigots in the wall to let water out for various functions. Overflow will go straight into the workshop reservoir, where I can make a valve to let the rest of the water out for the workshop if necessary. I then marked out the side of the pool. It'll constrain the bathhouse to be bigger than the workshop, about 15 by 20 feet, with a pool that's about 6 feet by 16 feet. I don't necessarily need a pool that big, but I want this to also be an experiment in different construction techniques, so that will also constrain the design. Specifically, I wanted to see if I could make this building out of concrete, and in my ambition, I wanted to make a domed ceiling so it would be an indoor pool. We'll just see how well that works. If we have two 10-foot diameter domes, about 2 inches thick, they'll have a volume of about 52 cubic feet. If it's supported by 6 cylindrical pillars, about 1 foot in diameter and 6 feet high, that's another 30 cubic feet. Then we have the reservoir, which is 20 feet by 2 feet by 6 feet, and about 3 inches thick. So that's about another 68 cubic feet, for a total of 150 cubic feet of material or so. If I'm making this out of concrete, I think the ratio I'll need will be 1/3 lime and the other 2/3 clay, or 50 cubic feet of lime and 100 cubic feet of clay. However, if I use a light aggregate like pumice, I could reduce the weight of the structure and how much concrete I need, say by about half, though it might reduce the structural integrity of the concrete by adding discontinuities. I'm not sure which is more critical. Either way, if the pool is 6 feet by 16 feet and 5 feet deep, that gives me a volume of about 480 cubic feet, so I'll have more than enough clay to work with. My solar kiln can cook up to 8 liters, 4 2-liter pots, of coral sand at once to make lime, or about 1/4 of a cubic foot, so I would need 200 batches of lime. It only takes a couple of hours to cook the lime to completion, so I could do another 6 batches per day, or 33 days. Even if I cut that in half with aggregate, and could somehow preheat the sand so I could cook a full batch every hour, it would take me just over a week to complete the project, and I'd probably still need more. Is there anywhere else I could save on material? Maybe if I could compress the pumice, I could cut it down to 1/3 the concrete necessary, so that's about 6 days. A squeeze, but I might just be able to make it starting today. With no time to lose, I switched out my last batch of lime and got a new one started, before making a run to collect pumice from my favorite collecting site along the beach. Those rubber gloves I made sure came in handy here, protecting my hands from the sharp pumice. If the structure needs 100 cubic feet of pumice, then I'll need to make about 17 trips with my wheelbarrow to collect it all. If each trip takes about 10 minutes, it'll take me about 3 hours. I decided to collect the material and put it close by so I could deal with the construction aspects more easily, stopping every hour or so to switch the lime out of the kiln. The remains of my sundial rig helped with that. I had a late lunch before beginning to prepare the foundations of the building, digging into the hillside a little to make room for the reservoir and to make the floor nice and flat. The hoe helped with this. I had enough lime on hand to at least get started with the reservoir. One problem with concrete, though, is that, unlike clay, it's runny, so that makes it hard to put in place, which is why concrete is usually cast, in one big piece or in bricks, rather than daubed into place like I've been doing with clay. From that, I conclude that I need to either make bricks or add more clay to the mix to make it workable, but I'm not sure what that's going to do to the final stability of the concrete. I figured I was here to experiment though, so I filled some bamboo sections to create small concrete cylinders to test different ratios of lime, clay, and aggregate, because I wasn't really sure which would work best. I tied a rock to a stick as a big hammer and smashed up the pumice before adding it to my mix as an aggregate. I spent the rest of the afternoon digging out the pool volume, since it didn't need to be made out of concrete. After the sun went down, and I washed the concrete off my hands before it could set, I spent a couple of hours applying tiles to the lab before going to bed, the larger tile pieces allowing me to do the job much faster than what I did in the kitchen. I could finish a whole batch of tiles in a couple of hours, and it wasn't like I needed to make a complex pattern for this one. Week 12, Day 2. I conducted my morning chores and then proceeded to conduct some tests on the various bricks I made the other day. Specifically stress tests, which felt great because it meant I got to do some actual engineering. The problem, though, was that I didn't have a weight I could actually measure on my scales to test the concrete's compressive strength. No point measuring its tensile strength because I know it's brittle, and I'm never going to use it in a tensile capacity anyway. The best thing I could think to do was to hit it with the hammer at increasing speeds, or with increasing weights, until the test cylinders broke. The instantaneous force they experienced should have been functionally the same as a static one, as far as breakage was concerned. I tied my hammer to a post, such that it would swing down and hit the test cylinder at the bottom of its swing. By knowing how high off the ground the hammer was, I could calculate how much force it was hitting the plug with, according to the equation of gravitational potential energy. PE equals mgh, or potential energy equals mass times gravitational acceleration times height. And because energy is conserved, I knew it would hit the cylinder with the same amount of kinetic energy. Effectively, the weight, mg, of the hammer was being multiplied by the height h it had to fall through, so I could tie on rocks or bamboo segments full of sand to carefully increase the mass of the hammer. Granted, this will technically be a dynamic load rather than a static one, the former typically being higher than the latter, but it's the best I've got right now, and will skew my results towards assuming the concrete mixes are weaker than they actually are, for an additional hidden safety margin. To make this easier on myself, I used a rock on the end of a long piece of cord that I tied to the top of a tree so that I could lift it higher than 1 meter and take advantage of that weight multiplying effect. For some of the mixes I didn't even have to do this test. They crumbled as I tried to get the molds off of them, so I knew those ratios were incorrect. Some of them, though, were much stronger, and I spent an hour or so dropping a pendulum against them until they broke, after which I weighed the hammer on my scales in the lab. Each plug had more or less the same volume, so I could use this information to quickly calculate which mixture had the greatest strength to weight ratio and the greatest strength overall. The latter will be used for the pillars, and the former will be used for the domes. I found that the best ratio for the cement mixture by itself is about 1 part lime to 2 parts volcanic ash clay, the same as for Roman concrete. The aggregate mixes were pretty evenly tied, but the best one I found was about 1 part cement, 2 parts sand, and 2 parts pumice, which was nice and easy to remember. That changes the ratios I calculated yesterday, so I need to start over. The optimal concrete mix is about 6.67% lime, 13.3% clay, 40% sand, and 40% rock. If I need 150 cubic feet of materials, that means I need 10 cubic feet of lime, 20 cubic feet of clay, 60 cubic feet of sand, and 60 cubic feet of pumice. At 0.25 cubic feet per batch, that means I need 40 batches of lime. I did 9 batches yesterday, so that means I should be able to finish all the lime I need in 3 or 4 days. Much better than my previous estimates. Glad I stopped to do some science. With all that calculated, I started working with the lime I had to start casting the various parts of the bathhouse. This was going to require a little more engineering, particularly for the pillars. I said I would need about 150 cubic feet, and the concrete has a density of about 140 pounds per cubic foot, or 21 tons divided between 6 pillars for 3.5 tons each. The concrete mix I tested had a compressive strength of about 4,000 psi, so technically the pillars don't need a cross-section of more than 1 square inch, double that for a safety factor. That was going to be impossible to work with, though, so I dug some molds in the ground for concrete tubes a couple inches thick and about 1 foot in diameter, since they wouldn't actually have to be solid in the middle to support all that weight. This would not only reduce the amount of concrete I needed even further, but also make the cylinders easier for me to lift by hand. I had to measure carefully to make sure they were all identical, otherwise the columns might end up buckling. And to make sure they all sat on each other snugly, I put a little lip in the molds like those concrete tubes they make for drainage ditches that go under driveways. It crossed my mind that, because these tubes were hollow, I could fit secret puzzle compartments in them later, if this were a mislike, and that thought made me happy. Next, I started mixing up my concrete and started filling the molds. Between digging them out, mixing, and filling them in, it must have taken a couple of hours. I stopped for lunch before I started working on the molds for the domes, and this turned out to be even easier in some ways than the pillars. I was originally thinking of casting the domes in one big piece, like some believe was done for the Pantheon in Rome. However, I figured that would be way too heavy and fragile for me to ever lift. I didn't think I could make a mold and cast it in place either, because the concrete was too runny. What I came up with instead was to make some nice, thin tiles and stick them together over the course of a few days, with a simple bamboo scaffolding to hold them up while they set. As long as they have something solid to stick to or rest on, they shouldn't droop at the apex, which is what I would be most worried about. What's more, I can sort of reuse the mold for the reflector plates to make these tiles fit together as nice, even hexagons. Technically, the fit won't be perfect because you need pentagons to make a good spherical tessellation, like the patterns on a soccer ball. However, the tiles should be small enough relative to the size of the dome that the grout between the tiles can take up the inevitable voids between them. This also caused me to realize that I need to make a change to my designs for the roof. Instead of having two separate domes, I thought it would be better to make one that's more like a cylinder with half domes on each end. This was because there would be nothing to support the ribbing between the double dome at the center, and it would collapse. I think I should also put arches between the pillars for added support, so maybe a little more Gothic than Roman, which is what I was originally aiming for. What's important is that it doesn't collapse on me, so I made a quick and dirty adjustment to some of the pillar molds so they would have arched wings off to either side, and a bit of a domed cap to them, with a groove down the center, which will help them hold on to the roof tiles later. With that figured out, I started digging some more molds in the ground, using a spare reflector plate as a guide, again being careful to make the dimensions as identical as possible. The dome is going to have a surface area of about 350 square feet, and I'm going to need about as many tiles. Knowing I had about 4 more days before the end of the week, I dug out a space of about 100 square feet that I could refill each day instead of digging out each tile individually, using the hoe to keep an even depth, and using my reference tile to build small partitions in the depressions I created. I then started mixing and pouring the concrete into them, which probably took another couple of hours. I didn't expect all these pieces to finish setting until tomorrow, so in the meantime, I continued working on the rest of the structure. I hadn't given a lot of attention to the reservoir design just yet, and while I kind of wanted to just make it out of clay and get it done, I also wanted to make sure I did it right and strong, so I wouldn't have to rebuild it again later, assuming I'm stuck on the island that long. The reservoir will be about 6 feet tall, which means it'll experience a pressure at its base of 17.9 kilopascals, or 2.6 psi. So the reservoir walls don't really need to be that thick. They just need to be thick enough that they don't buckle. I dug out another patch of ground and made patterns for rectangular bricks to make the reservoir out of, the same way I did for the roof tiles, adding pieces of bamboo to the shapes so that they'd be hollow and easy to stack on top of each other, like some real brick designs I've seen. Digging these out and filling them in, it took another couple of hours. With what little daylight remained, I dug out a little more of the pool volume before it was too dark to work outside anymore. I went back in and finished the tiling in the lab that I started the other day, before turning in early. Week 12, Day 3. After my morning chores, I got back to work on the bathhouse, starting by removing my concrete bricks from their molds in the ground and casting the next batch, with the exception of the pillar pieces, which I've already made enough of. As expected, they were really heavy, and I had to be careful not to hurt my back in the process of lifting them. But once they were out of their holes, they were easy enough to move around by rolling them. Stacking them one on top of the other was going to be hard though, not to mention dangerous once the pillars started getting taller than me. So I had an idea to erect them similarly to the pillars for my beach hut. I lined them up on the ground near where I needed them to be, digging a little depression into the ground for them to settle into. Then I threaded a length of bamboo or a sturdy stick through them, secured one end to the ground, and used a rope on the other end to erect the whole pillar at once. Mechanical advantage, baby! It didn't take too long to get them all in place, though I had to fuss with them a little to make sure they were all straight and level. Good thing I worked that out the other day when I was clearing the foundation. Between mixing, casting, and raising, this probably took a couple of hours. Next it was time to start working on that domed roof, but first I needed to build a scaffolding to hold it up. So I spent an hour or so cutting down, bending, and tying bamboo into appropriate shapes, which was easy and light enough to lift onto the tops of the pillars. I double-checked that everything was level, and filled in various spots with concrete grouting until it was. Then it was simply a matter of getting on my ladder and gluing my concrete panels together while they rested on top of the scaffolding. These operations probably took another couple of hours. I had a late lunch and then got on to stacking the bricks for the reservoir area, which was measurably easier than the last couple of tasks. It was simple and repetitive enough that I could kind of allow myself to get lost in my thoughts, though only up to a point. As I went, I stuck some hollowed pieces of bamboo into the wall between some of the bricks, where I could attach spigots for various additional elements of the bathhouse later. I also lined the inside of the reservoir with clay as I went, to make sure it was extra waterproof. I considered allowing it to fill with water early, so I'll have easy access to it for cement mixing tomorrow, but I didn't want to risk dislodging the bricks while they set. This took another hour or so. I spent the remainder of the daylight digging out the pool, ended up hanging one of my lanterns from the scaffolding so I could finish by the end of the day. I then had dinner and collapsed into my sweet, soft bed early again. Week 12, Day 4. I finished my morning chores and picked up where I left off yesterday, repeating my replacement of the bricks and stacking together the roof tiles and reservoir. Looking down from the top of the ladder, I started to regret digging out the pool already, because it meant I had that much farther to fall. By that point, it was time for lunch, and afterwards, I got started on some of the important fixtures for the bathhouse, since I had nothing else to do until the rest of the bricks finished setting. Adjacent to the reservoir, I dug a pit for the latrine, and used the clay I dug out to build 2 pots of particular designs. The first was a large, reinforced clay seat, with a funnel and hole at the base to collect wastes, which I made sure to glaze so it doesn't absorb any water and will be easier to clean. I decided to go for broke and make it a proper flushing toilet, which uses an upside-down, U-shaped pipe to create suction once the toilet has filled to a certain height. However, to avoid wasting any more water than necessary, I tried to make this tube as narrow as I reasonably could, and the bend close to the bottom of the latrine's funnel. Hopefully it shouldn't use more than a pint or 2 of water at a time. I left a hole in the back of the toilet where I could install a spout and valve once the seat was fired, which I'll connect to the spout in the reservoir as well, so it can function as a bidet. No need for toilet paper or washing my chapped anus when taking a bath anymore. I can hardly wait. The second pot I designed to have 2 sections. The first section will collect the solids and has several hollow pieces of bamboo running through it to facilitate drainage and allow air to diffuse into the wastes for accelerated decomposition, just like my composting bin, but hopefully I can use this to make fertilizer from now on instead. Though having said that, I should keep it in reserve for the tree saplings, rather than for the tubers I'm eventually going to put in my mouth. Returning to the subject at hand, the first section of the pot connects to the second with a passage that functions similarly to the toilet's flushing tube, sucking the liquids out when they reach a certain level within the first. Not very high because I don't want the solids sitting in standing water. It drains into a larger, separate chamber, since I anticipate most of the wastes to be water, and has a vent out the top. The heat of decomposition in the first chamber should cause the water and ammonia generated in the second to vaporize, so I'll attach a rubber hose to this vent to drain into a pot where I can collect it, or drain the second section if it gets too full. These pots probably took an hour each to design and turn on my potting wheel, and because they were so big and thick, I figured I'd give them an extra day to dry in the sun before firing them. I don't want to take any chances of them cracking. On the other side of the reservoir, I placed another spigot in the wall, and constructed a small clay bulb poked through with many tiny holes in it to act as a shower nozzle. Because it'll be so high up, it won't get a lot of pressure, and I won't even be able to use it if the reservoir isn't full, so it'll more pour or dribble onto me rather than spray, which should be adequate. I dug a little depression in the floor of the shower with a channel leading back to the rivulet for the shower runoff, into which I installed a hollowed-out length of bamboo and covered it up to act as a pipe. I built another pipe like this and connected it directly to another spigot in the reservoir, leading straight into the pool, so I could start filling it up. I also built a third pipe leading from the bottom of the pool downhill towards the workshop, so I could use it like the flush tube of the toilet to empty the pool into the workshop reservoir. I also decided to reuse the shower pot I built several weeks back, with the valve at the bottom of it, to act as a sink where I can wash my clothes and dishes. So glad that didn't go to waste now. I'm going to put it next to the shower and connect the shower head to the reservoir with another rubber hose later, so I can use it as a faucet. Furthermore, by lowering it to the height of the sink, I'll be able to increase the pressure for a stronger spray, which should make cleaning dishes easier. Between building the spigots, the clay bulb, the sink, the drains, and the hoses, I probably took another couple of hours. With the last hour of sunlight to kill, I decided I might as well go for even more broke and build a washing machine for all the clothes I've made, as they're going to get dirty and unpleasant soon, and washing them by hand takes time away from my projects. I made one last large pot which I left to dry overnight, and made some bamboo rollers and a framework to hold them, such that they can rest the pot on them partly on its side, kind of like a cement mixer. I'm not really sure how I'm going to power it yet. I might just set it up in the workshop instead of the bathhouse, and fill it with a hose connected to that reservoir because it's just easier. As the sun started to set, I collected some empty coconut shells, many with their fibers still attached, and drilled holes in them, which I stuffed with stiff reed bristles. These will act as brush balls that'll get tumbled with the clothes and brush them as the washing drum rotates. While I was on the beach looking for coconuts, I also picked up as much seaweed as I could find and burned it when I got back to base, because I remembered that burning seaweed produces sodium carbonate, also known as soda ash or washing soda, which was traditionally used as a clothing detergent. With the last 3 hours I had before bedtime, I decided to start using the tiles I've been stockpiling the last couple of days to begin tiling the pool area. The pool is 6 feet by 16 feet by 5 feet, so it'll have a surface area of 316 square feet. I've got a little over 2 batches of tile saved up, so that's a little over 180 square feet, and I'll cook another batch tonight. One more batch after that should cover it, and since I'm using the larger 1/6 square foot tiles, and I'm laying about 1 tile every 5 seconds, it should take me about 3 hours to finish the tiling. Should take about the same amount of tiles and time again to do the ceiling. I didn't really have any ideas for a pattern to arrange the tiles into, other than a reef to make it feel like I'm swimming in the ocean, but I didn't have enough blue pigment for that, and I didn't have a good idea of what the coral needed to look like. Besides, I could go swim in the actual ocean if I wanted to see coral. So I used the plain, whitish tiles I've been using for the lab to line the pool, running out well before bedtime. And although I went to bed a bit early, it was nice that I could take my time for once, and it was nice that I didn't exert myself today nearly as much as the past couple of days. My body is probably still trying to catch up a little. Week 12, Day 5. I got up in the morning and repeated the routine I did yesterday until lunch. Chores, concrete, molds, lay bricks. I'm visibly past the halfway point with my dome, and it's starting to look like one. Makes me excited. I built a privacy wall between the toilet/shower sections and the pool, and the bricks are really giving it that public pool sort of vibe, which I don't hate, but may consider covering with decorative tile at some point down the road. After lunch, I was kind of surprised that I had nothing pressing to do on this project, except wait for the concrete to set and for my pots to dry. Since I had enough of the roof built in, though, I decided to use the extra clay I dug up to make a sort of decorative molding around the edges of the roof, and a gutter to direct rainwater off and into the reservoir, adding just a little bit of lime to the mix to hopefully make it more stable. Looking back, I wish I'd built my other buildings out of this same sort of concrete, but it's far too late for that now. Didn't have the resources to at the time anyway. I still had loads of time to kill after that, and I'm considering putting up some sort of curtains around the openings in the pillars to protect the area from the weather and potentially any bugs like mosquitoes that might try to breed in the pool. It would sure make it look fancy. I took a moment to consider the resources involved in making that. The pool area is about 20 feet by 10 feet, and the arches are about 8 feet high to protect my over-tall head. So that's about 320 square feet of material, or about 30 square meters, minus the width of the pillars for 26 square meters. My loom can make about 1 square meter of fabric per hour, so that would take 26 hours or a little over a day if I left it running continuously. The real problem is that all my lime is earmarked right now for concrete construction. I've got so much of it, though, that I think I can spare a little to start juicing some fabric. Not that it's likely to be ready until tomorrow. Either way, I prepared a batch of potassium hydroxide and started some of my plant scraps grinding and dissolving. I checked on my latex stockpile, and I think that even after what I used up to make the hoses yesterday, I'll have just enough. I spent the rest of the day hanging out in the workshop and keeping up with the thread making machine. It takes about an hour before the thread machine finishes a batch, at which point I can install the reels on the loom, making sure to test and grease it up first, since it's been sitting idle and has so many moving parts. Once I was done stockpiling fiber and running the loom, and before I had dinner and went to bed, I finished tiling the pool and left the loom running overnight. Week 12, Day 6. This is it. Last day of construction on the bathhouse. I did my morning routine as usual, but loaded up the washing machine and pots into the kilns instead of making lime, since I won't need to make more concrete, at least until I decide there's a new project that needs it. I also reloaded the loom with fiber. Fortunately, there were no major bind-ups last night, as I made sure it was extra greased up before bed. I finished building the roof and reservoir area, and they look great. After lunch, I checked on fabric production and reloaded the loom again. Combined with what I already had stockpiled, I have enough fabric now to start working on the curtains, though I'll leave the loom running for the rest of the day to make sure I have some fabric stockpiled for later. I took some time to cut the fabric into the proper curtain shapes and hem up the edges. When I was done, I cut down some bamboo to make curtain rods, and used the lathe to make little bamboo rings to connect the rods to the curtains. Seeing the curtains flapping in the breeze made me realize that they would need to be weighted down, so I took some time to build a batch of tiles with holes in their centers, so I could tie them to the bottoms of the curtains, though they won't be ready until tomorrow. At this point, my pots were done cooking, and I removed them from the kilns to cool, but unfortunately, it was too late in the day to finish cooking the toilet pots using the solar kiln. I loaded them up anyway, so at least one of them will be ready by tomorrow morning, and the other will be partially finished. In the meantime, I installed the sink, shower head, and washing machine drum. I found at this point that I've run out of things to do again, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I've worked hard this week. With my last hour of daylight, I casually made another batch of tile and some lanterns for the bathhouse. As the sun went down, I unloaded the loom. Everything just feels like it's winding down for the Sabbath. I took some time to build a new pencil before having dinner and going to bed early. Week 12, Day 7. It's Sabbath, and finally time to try out my new pool. As I started my morning chores, I inaugurated the building by setting the reservoir to fill. It's probably going to take all day, but that's alright. I also put the button tiles I made last night in the kiln. Once I was done with my morning chores, I went on another walk around the island to collect different plants for making soaps today. While I picked the flowers of many, several I dug up to replant around the pool for easy access later, and they should have no shortage of water. I also collected more coconuts for the soap and seaweed for the washing machine. When I got back to base, I took some time to plant jasmine, frangipane flowers, and red pine cones around the bathhouse and watered them before I got some potash percolating and started stripping and squeezing the coconuts for oil. The whole building is going to smell like a spa. I also squeezed the alginate out of the seaweed before I burnt it, so I could use it for making more toothpaste. While the soap reduced, I had lunch, and by this time the toilet pots and tiles were finally set, so I carefully removed them from the kiln and left them to cool. After lunch, I started sewing the tiles onto the curtains, which took a long time since I couldn't use my sewing machine. The tiles would have broken the needle. It would normally have been a pretty tedious task, but I found it calming and meditative, as I just sat in the shade of the workshop and sewed. I lost track of time as it took hours to finish. When they were done, they were much heavier than I expected, but I mostly consider that a good thing. Because of the way I sewed them in, even hanging a few from the bottom like beads, they made a lovely clattering sound when they were moved around. I then installed them onto the bars I built the other day to see how well they slid. I also got a bit of bamboo cord and tied the curtains to the pillars so I could pull them aside when I wanted to go in or out. It gives the whole building a very elegant look. I was never into fancy things at home. Always felt like a waste of time and resources that could be spent on making life better for myself or others. That's never been more true in this place, and yet paradoxically, I enjoyed it more here than I ever would have at home. Perhaps it's because it's a luxury that I made with my own hands, from my own surplus resources, rather than at the expense of someone else who was doing it just as a job. I didn't have to waste their time, their life, just to make me feel special. I made this, and that makes all the difference. It was getting late at this point, and I couldn't really wait anymore. First, I took off my clothes and started the washing machine, hosing in water and washing powder and attaching the belt to the water wheel. I used my surplus fabric as a makeshift privacy towel as I walked to the bathhouse, figuring it would be just my luck for rescue to arrive while I was running around in the buff. I tested out the shower for a proper wash and rinse before finally getting into the pool. I floated around for a while, enjoying the coolness. Even though the pool is technically the same temperature as the air, it conducts the heat out of my body much faster, which is what makes it feel cooler than the air, in addition to taking some of that heat away as it evaporates. One thing I didn't entirely expect was that it was kind of loud in there, again like a public pool. The concrete roof was reflecting the sound of my splashing straight down into the pool, and the curtains weren't doing much to absorb it. I found, though, that my feverish mind wouldn't let me float for too long, so after drying off, I took my makeshift sarong and checked on my clothes. They've seen a lot of action the past couple of weeks, and a lot of dirt, so it's nice to see them clean again. I rinsed my clothes, hung them out to dry, and spent the remainder of the daylight cutting and sewing a spare change of clothes and a few towels, the one thing I didn't think of this whole week. There always has to be at least one in any project. Once the sun went down, I considered starting to tile the ceiling of the bathhouse. However, just hanging the lanterns was kind of a scary job, because I had to set my ladder at an angle over the pool to reach them. Furthermore, I realized the scaffolding was in the way, but I didn't want to bother taking it down tonight, and frankly I may not take it down at all. I'm still not confident that I made the roof properly, and I'd hate for it to collapse after all that work. The scaffold wasn't hurting anything anyway, but if I'm going to work on the ceiling later, I'll need to make some kind of solid platform over the pool to work on. That would also probably protect it from gunk and dust getting in. So instead, I just stargazed for a while before going in. I set up a lantern and a bowl of water by the sink in the bathhouse, so I could use it as a crude shaving mirror. After that, I brushed my teeth and went to bed. I should have been brushing my teeth every day up to this point, but I wasn't. That's going to change now that I have a good place to do it and a huge stockpile of toothpaste. Blooper Reel! Dear Diary, this week the cat licked my pizza and I'm upset about it, as I'll be able to use it as an additional water. Unlike Cray. Itchy nose. It's just that you think people care about you. And then they do things like this. And then they just turn around and do stuff like this to you. And I don't know. Feels like, you turn your back and they take advantage of you. You know what I mean? I could fit secret puzzle compartments in them later, if this were a mist-like, and and thought about and the repeating my placement of the bricks and stacking, repeating my placement of the bricks and stack my replace. Now that I've successfully broken both my legs, I can get back to work. No need for toilet paper or washing my chapped anus when taking a bath anymore. I can hardly wait. Pause it. And since I'm using the larger 1/6 of a square foot, 1/6 square foot, that's hard to say. Hey there, thanks for listening all the way to the end. Sorry the past couple of videos haven't got good subtitles. I broke my finger last week, so I haven't been able to type them up in a timely manner. I'll try to start doing that again as soon as my finger finishes healing up. I'm not going to let that stop me from putting out videos, though. So, if you want to find out what I make next week, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified as soon as it's ready. At least I can have all my digits in my imagination. Once again, I'm not doing YouTube for money. I have a job for that, where I get to drop heavy things on my fingers when I'm not making these videos. However, it would still help me out more than anything else if you could share this video with someone you think would enjoy it. And since you enjoyed it enough to watch this far, consider pressing the like button to tell the algorithm so. Also, if you'd like to chat about your own stories and perspectives on the episode, maybe a time when you got to make your own pool, feel free to write them in the comments section below. I genuinely love to hear them, and I always welcome suggestions and corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.